Bom dia, buenos dias, bonjour, and hello everyone. I'm Phil Bloomer, the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 16th Annual Mary Robinson event on business and human rights. There's simultaneous translation in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. This event was started by our founder, Chris Avery, in 2010 and has run every year since with a frontline keynote speaker. This year's event focuses on a topic which is squarely in the spotlight today: big tech versus the public good. Now, we all know that tech companies occupy an increasingly dominant position in our societies, and their power continues to grow vertiginously. But as we'll hear today, this gross corporate inequality of power and wealth is leading to abuse without accountability, and coupled with a ferocious effort by most tech giants to oppose and dismantle the emergent regulation that seeks to protect people and our environment from harm. Now, the Resource Centre has always said loudly that tech has enormous emancipatory potential. This global webinar, for instance, is testimony to that, as is the work of so many of our allies and partners in this movement that rely on tech. But tech also has enormous potential for abuse, for widespread infringements of privacy, for coercive algorithms at work, for addictive, harmful content for the young, hate speech, undermining democracy, and now, of course, ballooning greenhouse gas emissions. And these harms are now being turbocharged by generative AI. Now, we want to emphasize that these are not glitches in the system. They are a feature of the business model of most of the tech giants, as they drive for market dominance and maximize shareholder returns. So governments and investors and companies have a duty to prevent this harm through smart regulation that drives responsible business innovation, such as due diligence legislation, alongside, of course, responsible business conduct. And over the next 90 minutes, our keynote speaker, Kenyan litigator Mercy Mutemi, and our diverse expert panel from government to investors to companies to civil society will take us through these issues and describe what we need to do urgently to direct tech companies to deliver far more of the public good and far less public harm. We will follow our expert panel with a Q&A session for you. So please start thinking about all the questions you've got and put them into the chat, the Q&A function in Zoom. And we'll then curate those questions and make sure we try to synthesize them and get them to the panel. And if you'd like to chat a little more informally and broadly with the rest of the global audience, please write a comment in the LinkedIn live event. We'll post that link here in the chat, Zoom chat now. Now, we're incredibly fortunate to be joined today by our distinguished chair for this event, Mary Robinson. Mary, as many of you will know, is the co-founder of Project Dandelion, which is the women-led global campaign for climate justice. She's the adjunct professor of climate justice at Trinity College Dublin and a member of the Elders. Mary served, of course, as the President of Ireland from 1990 to 97, and then as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Mary is the recipient of the US Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. Mary is an author and, of course, the podcast host. And recently she became the joint honorary president of the Africa-Europe Foundation. Mary is also, of course, the honorary chair of our Resource Centre's own international advisory group and a close advisor to the Resource Centre. I personally, of course, and Mary will know this, I personally benefit greatly from Mary's insight and wisdom. So it's a privilege to have you with us again today, Mary, to host this event. And I hand over to you now for your own introductory remarks.
Well, hello, everyone. And thank you, Phil, for that introduction, that very kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to join the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre for this dialogue, and obviously an honour to see this annual series in its 16th year bear my own name. Today, we confront a challenge that cuts to the heart of our democracies, our economies, and our daily lives: the role of technological companies and their products and services in society. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll explore the opportunity for tech firms to serve the public good and the troubling reality that far too often they undermine it. It's one of the great human rights challenges of our time. Let me begin with a picture we all know too well. An Indigenous human rights defender tracked and harassed because surveillance technologies were sold to an authoritarian regime. Someone denied access to housing because an algorithm trained on biased data declared them unworthy of this service. A journalist documenting war crimes whose videos are deleted, shadow banned by a social media company seeking to appease powerful nations. These are not abstract harms. They are the lived reality of millions. Real live examples drawn from the Resource Centre's vast database tracking corporate human rights abuses. And they remind us that technology is never neutral. It can liberate, but it can also oppress. It can amplify truth, or it can turbocharge lies. Today, a handful of technology companies and the billionaire men that run them hold unprecedented power. They're wealthier than many countries. They command platforms that shape our democracies, and increasingly they act as geopolitical players in their own rights, negotiating directly with governments, setting the terms of public debate, determining who gets access to vital information and who does not. It's an uncomfortable truth that this narrow concentration of wealth and control risks warping not just markets, but our societies. Yet we must not lose sight of another fact. Technology holds extraordinary emancipatory potential. A responsible tech sector and its investors can bring to market products and possibilities for progress. Those that can give voice to the voiceless, connect movements across borders, and democratize knowledge on an unprecedented scale. The offerings of a responsible tech sector can aid in freeing workers from the drudgery, drive shared prosperity, and help us confront global challenges like the climate and nature crisis. In other words, even the current tech industry scope for harm is by now well understood. The opportunities to help deliver a better, more just world are nearly as broad. But this better future will not arrive by happenstance, nor will it be delivered by corporate benevolence. And it will not come from reacting belatedly to each new harm that this fast-moving industry may deliver, particularly as the harms fall hardest on those already marginalised. This includes women, girls, and LGBTIQ+ people driven from public life by online abuse and censorship. Gig workers racing to meet the impossible demands of coercive algorithms. Civilians suffering in war zones as AI is increasingly used to survey and make lethal targeting decisions from Kyiv to Gaza City. Instead, the answer to these harms is smart regulation of the tech sector, grounded in human rights and environmental due diligence. This requires companies anticipate risks before they become abuses, to prevent and mitigate harm rather than apologize after the fact, to be transparent and accountable for the impacts of their technologies across their value chains. And it demands that those best placed to anticipate and address those risks, the companies and investors designing, deploying, and profiting from these technologies, take the lead, and in doing so, or else they face legal consequences. It's long past time to move beyond the Silicon Valley mantra of move fast and break things, and particularly where what stands to be broken is the very fabric of our society. What we need now is to move deliberately, inclusively, and with an eye towards repair and prevention of systemic harms by this powerful private sector. As we'll hear today, examples of jurisdictions include Brazil and South Korea, dedicated to this idea are emerging. This is so even in the face of ruthless opposition from key tech giants and their accomplices. The European Union is another example. The Digital Services Act, The Digital Markets Act and the AI Act have the potential, with proper enforcement, to dismantle the dangerous myth of tech exceptionalism, the false belief that the sector is simply too innovative, too fast-moving, too special to be regulated at all. And the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, under pressure now, but progressing, provides a groundbreaking framework to require all large companies, including big tech, to put human rights at the center of their operations. This reflects a growing embrace of another truth, that regulation is not the enemy of innovation. It is instead what makes innovation safe, inclusive, and sustainable. Just as environmental and consumer safety standards have delivered cleaner power, safer cars, and better medicine, while engendering profit and innovation across those industries, so too can human rights standards drive better, safer tech that serves the public interest and shared prosperity. In today's world, I'm more certain than ever of my conviction, born of many years of working in service of human rights. Power must always be checked by responsibility. The tech sector is no exception. Our discussion today on detoxifying big tech and demanding it function in services of dignity, democracy, and justice, rather than simply the bottom line, could not be more timely. Today, I have the great privilege of welcoming our keynote speaker, Mercy Mutemi, to lead us in this discussion. Mercy is an African litigator and human rights in tech architect based in Kenya. She's the managing partner at Nzili and Sumbi Advocates, a law firm with branches in rural Kenya that centers human rights in law. She's also the co-founder of Oversight Lab Africa, which aims to achieve fair and equitable technology across Africa through research and strategic litigation. Mercy is best known, I admire her so much for this, for leading the first transnational litigation against Meta platforms, representing content moderators from across the African continent, who claimed human trafficking, exploitative working conditions, and psychological trauma. She's also a Ford Foundation Global Fellow 2025, Time 100 Next Honoree, and Business Daily Top 40 Under 40. So please join me in welcoming Mercy. And Mercy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for introducing me, and it's a pleasure, actually. Hello, everyone. It is a great honor to deliver this keynote. I thank the Business and Human Rights Resource Center for bringing us all together for this very timely conversation. I recognize the heaviness that has engulfed our world, a heaviness that stems from injustice that is often amplified by the business decisions of technology companies. Despite this heaviness, I am inspired by all of us who have gathered here to imagine a better future. Over the last 4 years, I have had the privilege of fighting alongside brave African content moderators as a litigator. These are young people who were trafficked into content moderation, for which they paid the hefty price of mental health harm. Platform workers also face a similar fight, where they have been brought to their knees by exploitative algorithms designed to extract forced labor. I have also fought for communities that have been destroyed by the algorithmic amplification of propaganda for war, hate speech, and incitement to violence by social media algorithms. I have learned from these brave leaders the devastating effects of the unholy alliance between tech companies, tech platforms, their local outsourcing partners, and governments. Allow me to share some of these lessons on what needs to be done to prioritize human rights in tech. As a starting point, I welcome us to reflect on the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reminds us of one fundamental truth. We as a people have inherent dignity and worth, and we have the right to have that dignity respected and protected. That truth must always guide us as a society. But does it guide tech companies? Investment, advancement in technology, innovation, the global race to be a tech superpower. These are the aspirations of tech companies. Really, their goal is the consolidation of power and market dominance at whatever cost. Their products, which dictate our civic, democratic, political, cultural, social, and economic realities, are treated by these tech companies as commercial products, where the only factors under consideration are how to keep the cost low while reaping skyrocketing profits. Often you find that respecting human dignity is not on the table. So picture this. A product is so recklessly designed that it leads a young child to death by suicide. Or a product so recklessly designed that it facilitates genocide and civil conflicts. Or worse still, a product that causes destruction of the environment, displacement of communities, and ostracization of minorities. Or a young African girl being trafficked to provide cheap labor for these products. And we are constantly and dismissively told to accept these injustices as the opportunity cost to business if we want our countries to participate in the global technology race. We are witnessing, in disbelief, the systemic infiltration of our political, executive, and legislative systems. You find laws that echo the aspirations of tech companies, laws that provide immunity to tech companies and tame regulators. This has become the norm. And what this does is it emboldens tech companies in their disregard for human dignity. Unfortunately, this is our dire reality. And as a community, we must pause and contemplate on how we got here, and more importantly, how we will get out of here. Look, we are people, and as people, we deserve better. Respect for dignity and for human rights must be by design. Our best interests must be the primary consideration before any business interests. So then how do we rewrite the formula to achieve this? I personally believe that each of us has a role to play to dismantle the status quo. For governments must awaken to the reality that their dereliction of duty only puts their country's sovereignty at risk. It is true that our societies grapple with the underlying problems of unemployment and poverty. It cannot be true, however, that to solve those underlying problems, we must surrender our dignity and allow companies to operate with abandon. Legislators must quickly act and change the legislative focus by balancing the primary duty to protect the dignity of people and uphold human rights vis-a-vis the secondary duty of economic advancement. Regulators must be creative in construing their mandate. They must give a purposive and liberal interpretation of laws and of harm and of remedies, because these are unprecedented times, and a pedantic approach does not rise to the occasion. Again, we look up to the judiciary to safeguard our rights and to hold tech companies and the government accountable, which is why our judges must be quick to expand their capacity on how technology works, how it interfaces with people, and what must be done to safeguard human rights, shunning external political influence. Constitutional courts are at a vantage position as they are only bound by fidelity to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Kenyan decision in April this year that constitutional court judges can indeed question algorithms when they impact human rights must be seen as a signal for us to trigger human rights frameworks in our different contexts. Ultimately, the solution lies in a change of approach by tech companies, for them to recognize the power they wield and choose to exercise it responsibly, to have real policies in place that put people first and not make decisions from the chase of celebrity and stardom. Shareholders can no longer play a passive role. The moment demands that they interrogate decisions made on their behalf and use their power for good. Now, we have one glaring handicap in this fight. The perpetrators of harm monopolize the data on harm. So researchers become our pathfinders. We must support them through resourcing, through enabling legal frameworks that allow access to crucial data and strengthening whistleblower protections. Journalists are now needed more than ever. If the fuel of injustice is misinformation, we must destabilize the system with factual, verifiable, and reliable news. Civil society, which has shepherded us through past revolutions, must also guide us at this time of crisis as well. May we consistently question, challenge, and advocate for better because we deserve better. Now, we need active and effective labor unions to test the boundaries of the current legal framework as we navigate platform and new age tech work, recognizing that our content moderators and algorithm training workers bear the brunt of experimental, unethical, and exploitative labor models meant to keep the cost of production low. Finally, users of technology, you and I, must evolve into active citizens of the world. We have immense power to deplatform, and we must figure out how to collectively exercise this power to demand for better protections for workers, for better algorithms, better governance, better climate protections, and more responsible business decisions. We all have a collective duty to not let things slide, or to let no injustice go unchallenged. Educate ourselves on technological advancements and the challenges they present to human rights, demand for better from our leaders, and specifically weed out politicians that are pandering to tech companies for their proximity. I will leave us with one question, because we have inherent dignity and we have a duty to make sure big tech respects and upholds it. What role will we play in reversing the status quo? I thank you.
Thank you, Mercy, for such a powerful keynote address. You've laid the groundwork so beautifully for what I know is going to be a really rich discussion that follows, and we'll pick up with you again in the question and answer with the audience. I'm Michael Clements, the Director for International Programs at the Resource Center, and I have the privilege of facilitating today's expert panel, which will pick up on many of these themes that Mercy has surfaced already. I'm joined today by Agnes Calamar, the Secretary General of Amnesty International, by João Branch, the Brazilian Secretary of Digital Policies in the Office of the President, by Wanda Lee, the Associate Director for Corporate Engagement at SHARE, and by Yogita Meseviciute, the Head of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Proton, as well as our own Gaia Kandatai, the Head of Technology and Human Rights at the Resource Center. So I'm going to jump right in, and to get us started, I want to turn to you, Agnes. Given the breadth of you and your team's work on freedom of expression and accountability and corporate responsibility, I wanted you to set the scene a little bit for us, what we're actually dealing with today and how big tech has shifted the global power dynamic in ways that really challenge the traditional human rights accountability mechanisms as we've always known them. So Agnes, over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. I've had some technical difficulties. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor. Thank you so much for the keynote and for Maria and Phil. Yes, I think that the meeting today could not have been more, in many ways, crucial. If there were three ways or three words to answer your question, I will say it's domination, monopoly, over definition of our present and our future. And you could also add a fourth concept, which is harmful. I will say inherently harmful. So domination, I think it's very clear. We have a handful of technology giants that dominate the field. They are essential infrastructures. We are all of us heavily dependent on both the technology and the companies dominating that technology. We also know that they dominate human rights violations and human rights impact because they dominate every aspect of our life: personal life, private life, public lives, relationship between the self and the government, between the self and the economic sector. They are everywhere. They have an outsized economic importance. Just a figure regarding the US big 5 companies. They represent a quarter of the US 500 stock index. Their business model is invasive. It's inherently invasive. It's about surveillance-based data collection, data abuse, data use, and it generates huge amount of revenues. The technology and the companies are central to global hegemony. We've already heard that, and therefore at the heart of the fight between China and the US, and probably as well Russia. They are central to political power at national level, and that has been made extremely clear during the inauguration of President Trump, when the CEOs of all major tech companies lined up behind him in a show of loyalty. They are part and parcel or central even to the increasing capture of the state that we have been witnessing and denouncing for many years now, but which is clearly accelerating. We could almost talk, at least in the US, of a threat of merger between state and big tech companies. Actually, it's not just the US. We have also seen that maybe between the Israeli government, Google, and Amazon through the project Nimbus. They dominate warfare. They dominate the militarization of our societies, the surveillance of our borders. They, meaning the technology, but also the companies. They dominate the future. They define the present and they define the future and the future. Artificial intelligence, generative AI, neurotechnology, biotechnology, robotics, all of these are not only under development right now, but they are absolutely at the heart of the future world, society, economy, politics, global and national. And we all know that now is the time to regulate them, not only for what they're doing now, but for what they may do in the future. So our response to the big tech in terms of the violation that they are responsible for right now is also absolutely crucial for future generations. At Amnesty International, we have engaged into a future rights project, and I can assure you that if we do not manage to regulate that technology now, such as vis-a-vis the brain or vis-a-vis biotechnology, we are creating a monster for our grandchildren and so on. I'm going to stop here just to say that going back to the word domination and monopoly, I think this gives us a sense of what we need to do, which is to break it. It does not mean that having millions of smaller companies will make it easier to fight back, but just to have a handful dominating the sector, dominating the global economy, dominating national economy, dominating information system. That is a disaster for democracy, for governance, for everything. So breaking up those monopolies must be at the forefront of what we need to do moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that powerful analysis to get us started. I'm gonna move quickly to the government perspective to build a little bit on what Agnes has just outlined for us. And João, I'll go to you. Brazil's obviously made some of the boldest moves in terms of tech regulation, from its early Internet Bill of Rights to the recent Supreme Federal Court decision on platform liability. So how is Brazil currently thinking about strengthening enforcement mechanisms for the sector to both harness tech's power for the region while navigating the political and economic pressures that so often arise when regulating this sector? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, and I'm honored to be part of this dialogue. Thank you, Ms. Mary Robinson, Phil Bloomer, and everyone that is organizing it. Firstly, it's important to say that Brazil understands that all digital economic agents are welcome in the country, be they American, Chinese, or from whatever, as long as they are willing to follow Brazilian legislation and to obey Brazilian court orders. So it's clear that establishing enforcement and ensuring that this is proportionate is challenging. Last year, you must remember that we experienced the episode with X, in which Elon Musk announced he would leave the country and stop complying with court orders. But the court's decision was to temporarily suspend the social network. But after a few weeks, X decided to resume cooperation. And since then, they're plainly available and compliant in Brazil. And this was because that was understood as a balanced approach for that. It's necessary to recognize the relevance of platforms for public debate and for small business in the country. And therefore, it's also clear that any application of sanctions must be balanced and phased. But anyway, the thing is quite alarming when big platforms aligned politically with governments decided to fight against democratic rules approved by national or regional parliaments, and so affecting our sovereignty. Recently, the Supreme Federal Court in Brazil ruled that the rule of non-liability for intermediary on third-party content failed to protect fundamental rights. And so it determined a notice and action regime, but with shared liability for ads and paid-for content, understanding that they become kind of partners in the content when they receive a specific investment for that. And also, this decision brought a duty of care approach to prevent serious criminal offenses online. On another approach for that, next Tuesday, President Lula will sign a bill approved by the Congress, maybe one of the world's most advanced laws for protection of children and adolescents in the digital environment. It's a law that imposes administrative responsibilities for digital platforms and reinforce tools for families to act in protection of their children and adolescents. We still have two bills, one on a broader approach for online safety, combating frauds, scams, another on market regulation, ready to be sent to Congress. They'll probably be sent next week. And last year, we approved the regulation of artificial intelligence systems in the Federal Senate. This bill is likely to be approved in the lower house by the end of this year. One of the issues here is applying copyright protection for training and mining as a tool to foster sustainability of professional journalism. Brazil is quite concerned about how we can keep the sustainability of this professional journalism as a pillar of democracy. So I would say that this is a summary of what we're doing, but we can in the second round approach more on the international arrangements that also support that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, João. And I'm going to turn to Juana because in contexts that are less like Brazil, where we're seeing very significant regulatory gaps being exploited, the role of investors as the providers of capital to the sector would seem to be particularly crucial. So let me open up space for you to describe how you see the role of investors in encouraging tech companies to adopt human rights-based approaches.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to the Resource Center for inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure. So to answer your question, I think investors play an important role in encouraging investee companies, including tech companies, to strengthen human rights due diligence. So I think to take a step back, responsible investors look to international standards to guide this work. So for example, investors have a responsibility under the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises to respect human rights, including in their investment portfolios. So the OECD guidelines provides guidance to investors on how to carry out this due diligence to avoid negative impacts on their investment, on society, on the environment, but also to avoid risks such as financial risks, reputational risks. The OECD guidelines also notes that increasingly failing to consider long-term investment value drivers, which could include ESG issues in investment practice, may be seen as a failure of fiduciary duty. So meaning that the responsibility of investors in engaging investee companies to respect human rights is absolutely critical. Investors with a commitment to uphold the UNGPs also has a responsibility to implement a due diligence process to identify actual and potential negative outcomes for people arising from investee companies, and technology companies are no exception. There's also a responsibility for investors to engage companies to prevent and mitigate these negative outcomes identified and track ongoing management of human rights outcomes as well. So in terms of due diligence process, this is inclusive of stewardship activities like engagement with investee companies on human rights. And I think through the use of these soft law mechanisms, it makes broad responsibilities for investors to have a clear role to play when it comes to holding big tech accountable, and also technology companies more broadly accountable on how their platforms may impact the rights of people online and society at large. And when I think about our engagement strategies at Share, we engage with companies individually on these issues, but also collaboratively with other investors through groups such as the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, as well as the Collective Impact Coalition for Ethical AI, led by the World Benchmarking Alliance.
Thanks so much for that one, and for really giving us a sense of how responsible investment is thinking about this. I think we're probably all wondering at this point what that looks like from inside a tech company. And so, Yogita, I'm obviously going to turn to you for this. Proton's demonstrated quite uniquely that respecting fundamental rights can be good business. So I'm hoping that you'll open the doors a little bit to the boardroom for us and give us a sense of what the principles that guide decision making internally at Proton are to really make that a reality.
Yes, hi everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak at this really important event. I'm really honored and I'm very happy to represent Proton. So first of all, maybe to answer your question, I think one of the most important points is that the whole company of Proton was actually founded after Snowden revelations. When our founder realized that something has to be done about security and privacy of people, and the scope of surveillance in the world. At that moment, there were no technologies that would prevent that type of surveillance. So essentially, 11 years ago, at the cafeteria of CERN, Proton was born. Very soon after, our first end-to-end encrypted product, Mail, was made available to consumers. And so I would say the very, very start of the company was really a sort of social mission to bring privacy of communications to every ordinary person in the world. And there are several very simple principles that we have in the company that makes our products really aligned with the respect for human rights and privacy and things like this. So first of all, we think that there shouldn't be a hard choice between tech that works and tech that respects rights. And this we're doing by using principles like privacy and security by design. What that means? That means that all our products are end-to-end encrypted. That means that's a golden standard for privacy and security. We cannot see our customers' personal information. We don't collect it. We don't use it. We actually, for us, the data of our users has no commercial value, because the privacy, that's what we're trying to deliver to our users. Another very important principle is the type of business model. And our business model is based on no ads principle. So it's really contrary to the business models of the big tech giants, where the exploitation of your most sensitive personal data generates massive profits to them. For us, we really function based on freemium business model, which means that for more than 90% of our customers across the world, all our services for free. And in fact, everybody can use our services for free. And a small fraction of our users who choose to pay for our services essentially pay for everybody else in the world. Another maybe important principle, which I do understand that may not be sustainable for every company, but it's very unique for us, is that we fund our own growth, which basically means we don't depend on rich investors who would dictate us the rules of the game and who could potentially compromise our mission of bringing privacy to the rest of the world. So that means maybe we're not able to grow as fast as other companies, but we can stick to our promise of privacy and grow sustainably. And the last principle that is also very important to us is transparency and accountability, which basically means that we're open source. Everyone can check our code, can check our transparency reports, and really verify if our end-to-end encryption promise is real or not. And I think all these principles are really keeping us in line with technology that serves for the benefit of the people.
Thank you, Yogita, for that. I think that insight is so valuable to this conversation and to our movement more broadly. Gaia, I'm going to turn right to you to respond to that, as well as what we heard from other panelists so far today. What is our evidence at the Resource Center, perhaps building a bit on Mercy's opening remarks, say about the need for a rights-respecting tech sector and how we get there? Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this powerful conversation. One of the clearest takeaways from the Resource Center's work on tech accountability is this: tech is special, tech companies are not. We must stop conflating the promise of technology with the conduct of companies leveraging it. Because the importance of oil is not the same as the importance of oil companies, and the value of water is not the same as the value of water companies. Tech in itself is not the problem. Unregulated power and extractive business models are. Our data, with over 12,500 news items and allegations linked to tech companies, shows that the human rights risks of this sector are systemic. The problems aren't confined to how technology is used. They're embedded across the value chain, from what these companies procure, what they build, who they sell to, and how they let it be deployed. This sector isn't just innovating, it's also replicating well-worn patterns of exploitation. For instance, when we looked at like a decade of data on tech companies, we found that 77% of human rights allegations were related to companies in the global north. So the profits and decisions sit in the global north. The market, the labor, experimentation, and harms are concentrated in the global south. And the groups most impacted: workers, women, children, gender and racial minorities, replicating the practices and patterns of unjust societies. These technologies, from Sudan to Myanmar to Gaza, that are marketed as tools of empowerment, are also enabling censorship, surveillance, and brutal targeting of civilians in conflict zones. It's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between a tech company and an arms company. Some of these tech companies are embedded in every aspect of our lives, and now they serve as an essential component of modern warfare. And they fail to act in the face of egregious harms. At best, they appear to be indifferent. At worst, they seem to be complicit. And while that said, another key insight is this: we've faced extractive giants before, tobacco, oil, sweatshop manufacturing, and we found ways to regulate them. That same political imagination, that collective pressure is what we need now to fix what tech has done. Thank you.
Gaia, thanks. And I think those are incredibly important insights for this next phase of our discussion, where I wanted us to go a little bit deeper. Agnes, I'm going to turn back to you. Given your extensive experience in this space over time, I wanted you to reflect on some key examples where we've seen the big tech business model directly undermine the public good, or maybe even international law. And what we can take from those examples. I'll ask you to give us 2 minutes on that, and then we'll hear from others.
Wow. Okay, 2 minutes. We have plenty of examples. Meta algorithm in 2017 in Myanmar that contributed to the genocide against the Rohingya community. X algorithm in the UK that contributed again to misinformation inciting violence against Muslims in the UK, including a tragic attack in Southport. Third example, which we just published, is X contribution to the spread of targeted hate against LGBTI people in Poland. Fourth example is in the aftermath of Roe versus Wade. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok have removed abortion-related content, including how to access abortion care. And Amnesty International research shows that some content with information about medication or non-surgical abortion, which are safe and account for about half of all abortion in the US, though this information was either removed, temporarily hidden, or marked as sensitive content. Last example, Meta's failure that contributed to abuses against the Tigranian community during the conflict in Ethiopia. These are just some examples taken out of Amnesty's work. It covers so-called peaceful situation, so-called armed conflict. It covers a range of people and communities. Women, LGBTQI could have spoken about TikTok and children. We published a very big research last year on the harmful impact of TikTok on children's rights. So there are sadly multiple examples coming from our work, and I'm not mentioning, of course, the work of others. We are now using all kind of tools to respond to it, but I know we'll have more opportunity to speak to it. So I think that the conclusion is that these technologies, unbridled, unregulated, growing in spread, reach, and power, supported by authoritarian leaders around the world, fed by our toxic addiction to profit, are impacting on rights at all levels. Rights in armed conflict situation, freedom of information, freedom of expression, equality, dignity, a sense of safety, and so on and so forth. I have not quoted from the people with whom we are working, whoever they are. I will say there is one quote that summarizes the situation for them all. At an individual level, the situation created by those algorithms and the lack of regulations is cut by it's 1,000 cut, basically, at all levels. And it's scary. Thank you.
No, thank you. And against, I think what you're framing for us, which is these are global harms and happening in all jurisdictions of the world. João, I want to come to you because to really ask you how your government is using its position to influence global digital conversations and governance and help steer international norms towards a more accountable tech sector to counter some of the examples and others like them that Agnes has set out for us. So João, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. We actually have adopted a three-part strategy here. The first is to contribute to strengthen the multilateral environment. As you know, President Lula is quite dedicated to that. And to this end, we actively contribute to the United Nations processes, including the dialogue with the Department of Global Communications in the New York office, with the High Commissioner office in Geneva, and UNESCO as the agency responsible for communication and information. If we take the example of the Global Digital Compact, we had for the first time information integrity brought to the table and approved by consensus last year. We also brought the topic of information integrity to G20 that we had the presidency last year, and we reached a very high level consensus on that. But we also contributed to other coalitions of countries like OECD. OECD approved their recommendations on information integrity in December 24, and they are signed by the 38 countries of OECD and Brazil that was invited to sign, especially because of this dedication for that. But the second strategy is still within the multilateral framework, is building alliances for action. So currently we are focusing on the Global Initiative for Information Integrity on Climate Change, connecting the discussion on climate action and the discussion on information integrity. So we have UN, UNESCO, UNFCCC, Chile, France, UK, Denmark, Sweden, Morocco, and Uruguay involved. And this responds to a concrete call coming from the Global Digital Compact, paragraph 35.e for the interested ones. And the third strategy is to reach out to like-minded countries and build dialogues on global digital governance and strategies to strengthen transparency, algorithmic transparency. So we have a dialogue at this moment with Spain, Chile, and opening with South Africa and the Philippines and Indonesia to work on that. We're really open to other countries that are interested in building concrete alliances with like-minded countries dedicated to that.
Thanks so much for that, and we'll pick up on some of what you said in the next round as well. But Buana and Yogita, I want to invite both of you into this part of the conversation now. We've heard from you the very critical role that investors can play in driving change for the sector, but I want to ask you to reflect on some of the key challenges that you see investors facing in trying to meaningfully engage with tech companies. And equally, Yogita, we'll go to you after that for the sort of perspective of a company that does center rights in its operations, why this is so hard and what needs to change to make this more the rule rather than the exception for the sector as a whole. I want to ask you both to sort of keep it to 2 minutes so that we can have plenty of time for question and answers. I can say that the audience is very active in the background. So Buana, first to you, challenges that the tech investors are facing and why that is.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So I think in terms of challenges that we've had with tech companies, particularly big tech companies, I think one of the biggest challenges has actually been related to governance. So in particular, companies like Alphabet or Meta, they exercise absolute decision-making due to the dual-class share structure that exists. So it remains an incredibly difficult barrier for investors to be able to bring material issues, particularly those related to ESG forward to big tech companies. To illustrate, how the dual class share structure impacts our ability to engage big tech companies. Since 2022, we've filed a shareholder proposal at Alphabet, requesting the company to conduct and disclose the results of a third-party human rights impact assessment related to its AI-driven targeted ads. Ads account for more than 75% of their revenue in 2023 and 2024, making it material to the company. But as we know, and some of the panelists already talked about this, targeted ads have been found to potentially perpetuate adverse human rights impacts like discrimination or bias. And the company, from what we're seeing, does not have sufficient due diligence processes in place to be able to identify and address those risks. So as I mentioned, these proposals have been filed since 2022. We've had relatively high vote results, at least based on the independent vote, and the company has not been receptive to shareholder concerns because of the governance that currently exists at the company. I think just very quickly in terms of addressing governance concerns, since 2021, we have been engaging with Meta on board oversight and governance reforms. We filed a proposal last year related to amending their corporate governance guidelines to ensure that the chairperson and the lead independent director has the ability to include items on the agenda independent of the other. Because with Meta, as we all know, the board's lead independent director can have additional power to add items to a company's board meeting, where, for example, at least at Meta, the CEO, board chair, and controlling shareholder is one individual. So we were successful in this engagement. Meta updated their corporate governance guidelines. It's a small change, but definitely something that has been valuable in terms of amending some of the power that we currently see within their governance structure.
Thanks so much for that, Juana. And Yogita, come in from the company perspective. Why is this so hard?
Yeah, sure. I think the answer is very clear. It's very hard because at the heart, as it was mentioned before, at the heart of the business model of those companies is the data exploitation, because it brings the most profit and shareholder value maximization. So unfortunately, it's a very tough thing to solve because of how the companies are built. So I don't have that much hope for that. However, what can be done is adopting regulations and strong enforcement of frameworks, like, for example, in EU Digital Markets Act that promotes competition, fair rules, more opportunities for alternatives, and more rights to consumers. Because at the end of the day, what we need, I really don't believe that we can just hope for those big companies to change again because of the business model that they have at heart. But if we have laws that, at least put some restraints and some rules on how those companies can behave, and rules that would give a fairer chance to compete based on merits for alternatives, like, interoperability, fair access, users' ability to switch and vote with their feet, that would be already a very big incentive for the bigger ones to at least moderate their practices, because that's how it works, that's how it works in physical world. You don't like one shop that treats you bad, you go to another one. That's how it should be in an ideal world in the tech world as well.
Thank you. I mean, we've obviously already covered so much ground today, and I want to make sure that we have time for our audience. But before we get there, I just want to return briefly to you, Agnes, and to Zhao. The last two questions that I have are really around kind of agency and how we challenge power, if that's the remedy here, and how we ensure that the future of tech is shaped by people, not just these platforms and companies. So, João, I'm going to go first to you. As someone designing public policy from the inside, what role do you see for diverse voices, so rights holders, civil society, grassroots movements, in shaping Brazil's approach to tech governance, and what can the rest of the world learn from that? 2 minutes.
Well, I would say that we wouldn't have approved this bill on children and adolescents, for instance, if there wasn't a big pressure and presence of civil society organizations on this approval. But of course, Brazil has kind of a formal approach for participation in the regulatory process themselves. So it's a basic, I wouldn't say that it's not a closed one, it's not a completely open one. I think the most strong example we have, a good example, is the Internet Steering Committee that runs the registers name and numbers distribution here, that has a wide participation of different stakeholders. But internationally, we are working with this multi-stakeholder approach in this global initiative for climate change, for information integrity on climate change, bringing the involvement of researchers, network of researchers from the global south and the global north, civil society activists, and building upon this multi-stakeholder approach, I would say a stronger alliance where international organizations and countries work very connected and very, let's say, handed with the civil society. So that's, I would say that internationally this is working quite well. Nationally, we have good examples. The current participation in the regulatory regime itself is basic audiences, participation, consultations, and things that are more formal. So this is a debate that we should actually foster internationally as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And finally, Agnes, to you, in this moment when we're seeing human rights under such pressure globally, what examples of resistance or of victory give you hope for the fight to reclaim the tech sector so that it is working in service of human dignity and progress for all, as Mercy so ably put it in the beginning?
You know, I think we really need to take stock of the fact that we are living in a different world than even a year ago. And around the world for the last 8-10 months, we have seen many countries, many governments abdicating their power, abdicating their responsibilities in order to please somebody sitting in the White House. We have seen abdication time and time again. And as long as we have seen that, as long as we do not see government, such as, for instance, Brazil, standing up, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to rein in the big tech companies in particular, because there is such a merging right now of interest between the US government and the big tech companies, and between the Chinese government and their own big tech companies. So we need really strong alliance, and we need governments ready to fight back and not to abdicate and to make deals. We need to fight the fact that companies, not just big tech, but the search for profit has become the overwhelming definition of the society, the global society we live in. So I just want to insist on that, because those big tech are not operating into a vacuum, and they are actually constructing the global economic, political, military system that we are working on. And we need to locate our action within that global context. Further than that, or other than that, what we think can work, and what we are engaging in at Amnesty International is more and more strategic litigation. I'm very, very glad with the keynote speech that we've heard. I think this has to be a key driver for the voice of the people, the voice of the victim to be heard. I will encourage everyone to look at litigation, people's power, people's campaign, organized campaigns focusing on the demands for regulations, demands for divestment, demands for sanction. I know the Brazilian representative was having a bit of doubt about that. I'm sorry, but from Amnesty standpoint, when you see how big tech, some of the big tech companies are contributing to benefiting from Israel's genocide in Gaza, there is no other response to that but to call for sanction against those companies, technology companies that are feeding the mass surveillance system that is allowing for unlawful occupation. And it's just one example over many. Those companies are completely immersed, engaged in a range of situations that are amounting to massive human rights violations, whether they are fully knowledgeable of it or whether they are just not using their due diligence responsibilities. It will depend on a case-by-case basis. But in every situation of massive human rights violation right now, you will be finding big tech involved somehow. How are we to respond to that? We, the people, but to demand that our governments and representatives sanction them for what they do. And the divestment issue is also important. We are all users, and I've heard that before. We need to act as our conscience dictates peacefully. We have major power to limit the power of big tech and other companies. But for that to happen, we need options too.
Yes.
And that's why I was highlighting the monopoly issue. And I think there too, there is a major role to play. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I think a really important sort of set of call to actions for all of us. I want to open this up to our audience. We've had a very active Q&A all throughout this. So I'm going to invite Mercy back into this conversation. So please include questions for her. Use the Q&A function, but you already are on Zoom. And we're going to try and consolidate questions so we can get through as many as possible. But Gaia, there's quite a few for you already. Mary and Mercy touched on this earlier, but one of the recurring pushbacks that we're hearing from big tech, and certainly seeing it in the US as Agnes and others have flagged, is that regulation stifles innovation. But what does our evidence actually say on this point? And what policies or tools are rights holders saying are needed to protect and harness protect rights and harness tech's power potential for everyone? So over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Well, that's what certain interests would like us to believe, because regulating pharmaceuticals hasn't killed medicine, and regulating environmental harms has not killed energy innovation. If anything, regulation has helped these sectors grow responsibly, saving lives, protecting ecosystems, making sure that we all have good outcomes without unchecked harm. But when it comes to tech sector, especially big tech, we're told don't slow us down. And we've seen how they've responded to questions around Gaza, for instance. When we reached out to 104 tech companies, a mere 4 responded. And to me, that demonstrates that transparency is not only optional, it is actively resisted. And due diligence is really just seen as a courtesy and not a responsibility, right? And the same applies to gender harm, which is across the value chain of tech. Now, this, as Phil pointed out, is not a glitch in the system. It's producing exactly what it was intended to produce. And it is an outcome of lack of regulation and enforcement, because no consequence means no compliance and no care. So I think that as far as regulation goes, some of the key areas that we need immediate regulation is around mandatory verifiable human rights due diligence, which is not left to voluntary codes, and no public procurement must be allowed without that kind of compliance. The second area is around enforcement around transparency, guardrails, red lines for accountability, and consequences. I think coming back to consequences, not just fines. There must be far more consequences than just fines, because the ability to operate in Brazil or India or any market is not an entitlement. It's a privilege. It's a privilege that must be earned, and it's a privilege that must be maintained. But going back to what Agnes said, I think the main thing we need at the moment is stronger protections around interoperability, whistleblower protection, and data access, because this monopoly isn't fostering innovation, it's suppressing it. It's holding users hostage, and it's leaving us bereft of any choice or agency. And this obsession with dominance, absorbing competitors, outspending challengers, calling on governments to thwart efforts in other sovereign spaces, that is really what is stifling innovation. So I would leave it at that. And I think that perhaps on regulation, the one last thing I would say is perhaps regulators can borrow from tech. They must move fast on regulation, on enforcement. And the thing that needs to be broken is impunity and monopolies.
Thank you, Gaia. And you actually answered a number of questions in our queue in your answer. So extremely helpful for timing. Yogita, we have one for you. Globally, where do you see, from Proton's perspective or based on your experience, where do you see opportunity for progress in developing a more rights-respecting tech sector? And what is that looking like it requires?
So I think the answer is quite simple, and it was already mentioned before. I think we need certain laws. Countries who don't have anti-monopoly privacy laws should think about them and should legislate them. The ones that have should make sure that they are properly enforced, because it's really about making sure, as I mentioned before, that there is a possibility for alternatives to emerge and be able to offer rights-respecting products for users. And those users should be able to choose, to have a choice to move, to switch, to port their data, and to use the companies and products that respect the rights. So for that, we need interoperability, data portability, restrictions on the biggest players' exploitative business models by laws. And we really need international alignment on that. So it's not 5 countries in the world pushing those standards. It's really many countries that should come together and start pushing for the same idea of better tech. And that's where the change and opportunities will come.
Thank you. Joao, I want to go to you. We're getting a lot of questions on AI and governance of AI. So wondering if you have any thoughts on the need for transnational governance of AI and AI supply chains, and whether there's a need for an independent AI governance body to be established in some way.
I would say so, yes. And actually, the Global Digital Compact approved that as a way for the global debate. We now, I think 10 days ago, there has been the launch of the parameters for the International Scientific Panel on AI, which will certainly help to drive that. And there is a debate also on how to drive the discussion, or what the role of the international system on governance of AI. Of course, we have the particularities of each country, but we know that if we don't if the UN doesn't take a lead on how you drive these discussions to protect human rights at the same time that you balance the discussion on innovation, we will find ourselves in a very difficult situation in a few years' time, as we have been finding ourselves in this discussion on social media. So we have to learn with the inaction that we had in the international realms system of human rights on these issues and act before it happens on AI.
Thank you. Agnes, I'm going to give one to you. We're sort of consolidating a few questions here, but in examples, including some of the ones I think that you flagged for us, where we do see a state or a regulator coercing and even an unwilling company to abide by certain directives that may undermine human rights, how should the international community respond? How should the private sector respond to ensure safeguarding of rights in those circumstances?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's particularly new. These, in fact, are far more in keeping with the first 20 years of our internet world. During that time, when I was working at Article 19 in particular, what were we doing? We were protecting those bloody companies against infringement by the state. I mean, I think all of us here may have played that role. And now we're just on the other receiving end. So trust me, when I say we have plenty of experience to act if the companies are being forced to do things that goes against fundamental rights by a state. That is almost the bread and butter of human rights, of litigators, of everyone. The problem is not what we are confronting at the moment. Of course, this is still part and parcel of what's happening. I've seen the example of India. We will have litigation in the way of responding to that. Those companies will also litigate, no doubt, to protect it. Proton will have plenty of experience pushing back against governments wanting access to so-called criminals or terrorists using Proton. So, you know, this is our bread and butter. We know how to fight back. We'll win some, we'll lose some. Right now, it's a bigger fight. It's a different fight. It's a fight for the nature of our society and even for the nature of what it means to be human. I want to insist on the fact that what we regulate now will be crucial for the protection of dignity of our grandchildren. The key investment, one of the key investment is in neurotechnology, is in brain development. In 10, you know, the prognostic is that in 10 years, maybe less than that, there will be ways of shaping the brain waves. If that is not regulated now, and that means regulating the companies, because we can regulate the state in its medical use of the brain, we don't regulate companies. Can you imagine what that will, how this is going to impact on our society and on our children? So that's my response. We can handle those situations that your colleagues, the participants are highlighting. We will win on some occasion, we will lose on others. We have the tools. Sadly, we are in a different environment right now, I think, and we really need to hype our game.
Thank you. Mercy, I want to invite you into this conversation here. One of our questions is that it is so difficult for countries in the global south in particular to be navigating some of these challenges. So from your perspective, how do we leverage coalitions between countries and civil societies within those countries, law associations, bar associations, to be able to press for change?
Thank you. So I see the problem to be a little bit different. It's not that we cannot act, it's that we understand the problem, which is that there's a commingling of our underlying problems, poverty, unemployment, and the solution that tech seems to offer. There's this narrative that big tech is coming in to solve this fundamental problem, so you should allow them some leeway to break some rules. Or if you try to regulate, then they're going to migrate and then the country is going to suffer. It's as if we've understood the problem and then come up with the wrong prognosis for how to solve the problem. So I think where the collaboration is needed, first of all, is to help governments understand what is actually happening. The model that we currently have does not lead to growth. That's the first thing. The exploitative labor model does not contribute to increased solutions in solving unemployment. For example, in content moderation, in platform work, we understand that a lot of those jobs do lead to a lot of mental health harm. So you see early entrance into the job market and then also early exits. We've not solved a problem, we've just created another problem, a social problem, a communal problem that is now more complex and cannot be solved. So we need to, first of all, collaborating, sharing of information. What are these jobs that are being done in the global south? What is their impact from an economic perspective? Yes, but also from a cultural perspective and a social perspective. Again, what is the value of these jobs that are being done in our countries, on our continents? It cannot be that we're training, for example, the algorithms for American companies and also do not have a local AI industry. What can the government do to leverage for better ways of doing this work that actually leads to sustainable growth for the countries, to dismantle the exploitative model? Again, litigation is going to play a big role here. But how strategic litigation works is we have to learn from each other. We have to study what Brazil is doing, understand what the better models are. We have to also study what the EU is doing, even where the context is different, and adjust to what happens here. We have a good human rights framework on the African continent. Kenyan courts are proving that human rights frameworks can be and are effective in regulating tech. So what can we learn from there and how can we replicate it? Again, connecting communities, whether it's workers that have been affected by big tech, but also the communities themselves that have been impacted by algorithms, connecting them together and helping them figure out, okay, what does organizing look like? What solutions can we come up with? That consolidation of power is the ultimate solution to the consolidation of power that is happening from big tech. It has to be for power at this point. Ultimately, regulators must act. What we're seeing on the African continent, for example, is a very, very restricted understanding of their mandate. They do not seem to believe that they have regulatory power over big tech, and big tech is playing into this narrative where you take them to court, you take them to the regulator, and the first line of defense is that we are not amenable to the jurisdiction of Kenya or South Africa or Nigeria. They do not want to be held accountable outside of the US, and even in the US, of course. But regulators now have to just go blaring and be creative about it. Let big tech figure out the jurisdiction problems, let them challenge them in court, but an objection is just an objection. It doesn't mean that if a tech company says you cannot hold me accountable, then you cannot hold it accountable. Our laws give these regulators mandate, our constitutions give them mandate, and if that means that they have to battle it out in court, let it be so, but let it not be that the regulator did not move where there was harm. Thank you.
Mercy, thank you. This is why we wanted you for our keynote. Very helpful. We're coming to the end of our discussion, and I see how much more there is that we could talk about. But I have two brief questions. One, the first one to you, and I'll ask you to give it 1 minute, and that's really around this observation that the audience has made that financial fines often fail to deter repeated abuses by big tech. So what do you believe is needed? What would be the most effective way of increasing big tech accountability in the case of human rights violations? 1 minute, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. So I think everyone is right. Regulation is critical for this piece. I think we need stronger regulation and updated regulation in order to ensure that there's consequences for companies that do not respect human rights within their business and operations. And I think, in light of the fact that there is limited regulation globally for big tech companies, we've been engaging with companies to strengthen risk management processes, to strengthen overall governance related to AI and AI-related risks. We've been successful to some extent in strengthening also human rights due diligence processes, policy commitments within companies, because I think education is really critical to educating companies on what those risks look like and why they're relevant to that particular company. As a developer, as a deployer, et cetera, that will all look different. So it's also the education piece that's critical in those individual company engagements.
Thank you. Gaia, I'm going to give you the last word, 30 seconds, final thoughts as we wind down, and then I'll hand over to Phil. Anything that's been left unsaid, or what gives you hope for what's possible in the future out of this conversation?
Well, thank you. Michael, I think that there is hope, right? We are seeing increasing, even though these fines don't really matter, because Google, for instance, the announcement just last year was 116 billion in revenue. These 2 or 3 billions in fines don't matter, but it still adds up. And I think that the more states exercise that power, the more outcome we are going to see. We are seeing more discussions around antitrust action, more discussions around what this means for sovereignty. And I think that's where the interest needs to go now, looking at the human rights angles to antitrust action. But I want to say the thing that gives me the most hope, especially now that I'm in Nairobi in this fantastic event, speaking to labor organizers, speaking to people who are pushing back on AI, people like Mercy really give me hope, because her role has had a domino effect. We now see action in Ghana. We now see, international associations of content moderators forming. And I think that's what we need. For us to imagine a different future, I think different actors need to show up differently, not to play catch up, but to actually set the tone and set the pace.
Thank you, Gaia. And an enormous thank you to this extraordinary panel. I think we could all talk for another 2 hours. But I'm going to hand over now to our Executive Director, Phil Bloomer, for some final closing thoughts. Phil, over to you.
Thanks very much. Wow. Well, that was a fantastic speeches and panelists. I've learned so much myself through this 90 minutes. I think the first thing I'd say is just we've heard clearly today the scale and the scope for emancipatory action, for liberatory action, but also for the extraordinary levels of harm that are being created from Gaza City to Kiev, to young people, to workers, to indigenous people, women, and so the list goes on. I think, secondly, I'd say that we've heard a really clear sense from particularly the investors and the companies on the panel that there are different principles that can be applied. That this is not inevitable. That this is not a glitch. It's a feature of the system, and it's been designed deliberately to deliver what it's delivering. And so equally, there's an opportunity now to fundamentally shift that approach. And I think that way in which Mercy and Mary spoke about that deliberate design that really insists that we start to regulate these companies to direct capital, to direct their business behavior towards far more of the public good and far less of the public harm is the way to go. I think we've heard very much also that there's no reason for this exceptionalism. It's a falsehood of the exceptionalism that's described. And equally, that regulation drives innovation. It doesn't stall innovation. Good regulation, smart regulation, drives the right kinds of regulation, that drives the right kind of business behavior that will deliver far better quality of growth. As Mercy was just saying, the quality of the growth is fundamentally important. Growth for a company means massive market domination and returns to shareholders. But growth for an economy means we have decent work. We have people enjoying the securities and protections that they need to be able to live lives of dignity. And so it's not, as Mercy also was highlighting. But that smart regulation also has to be really future-proofed. And for that, we need the kind of work that Zhao has been talking about, that stakeholder engagement, bringing people in to be able to deliver the kind of competition policy, as well as the due diligence work, as well as other approaches that are being taken around the world to make sure that we're directing that capital towards sustainability and towards human rights respect. I think the governments now are clear that it's clear that governments have a choice. They have a choice between, as it was described, abdication of responsibility and indeed capitulation, or whether they're there to really do their primary function as states, to protect and deliver security for their citizens. And so we've heard as well here from across the panel and indeed from the speakers that we will only be able to achieve that security and that protection if we have strength and unity. That the strength and unity that comes from the multilateralism that President Lula is trying to drive forward now as the multilateral system comes under enormous strain, but also that of like-minded countries getting together to build their collective power to speak out, and indeed then indeed the unusual alliances that we're going to need in this emergency. As Anya clearly described it, we need the unusual alliances that will come from civil society working with responsible investors, responsible business, and indeed responsible governments. And that level of regulation will also give the opportunity for that strategic litigation, which builds the legal risks, which drive the right kinds of innovation inside those companies. So we have a clear vision, I feel, a really clear vision. We have a massive transition going on in technology. It can be for the good or it can be for ill. Just as we have in climate change, a massive transition for good or for ill. But we've got to have technology working more for the public good and not for market domination or the maximization of shareholders. That will take that grand alliance that's necessary of responsible governance, civil society, companies and investors. And that sense that we can deliver together will also, I believe, deliver the kind of hope that's necessary amongst so many citizens. But it will also deliver clearly to many governments who are wondering whether to capitulate or not, a sense of electoral danger if they do not act. And that's critical to many governments, that they understand that it's dangerous for them not to act to protect their citizens. So I just finished by saying an enormous thank you. An enormous thank you, obviously, firstly to Mary for this event, which we're able to do every year, to Mercy for being our keynote speaker, to Zhao, to Yogita, Juan, Gaia, for that fantastic panel and all the wisdom that you've delivered for us, but also to Michael, and indeed to the whole of the Resource Centre team, including our board, that puts so much effort behind the scenes to make this event happen. So with that, I'll say an enormous thanks to everybody.